would like to talk to you today about something I like talking about, is the whole notion of how did we get to high SPL concerts? When did it change? What are the reasons? And you can already guess there are going to be many reasons. So let me just get right into that, and then hopefully I will have some time for questions and discussions with the 15 minutes that we just lost. Oh, yes, I am Jos. I am one of the Hella initiative takers. I am a music technologist at School of Music, the National University in Canberra, but my background is as a live sound engineer. I worked in the Netherlands and toured worldwide between 1995 and 2010 or so, and then I, for some reason, fell into academia. I'm still not really sure how that went, but here we are. And my main focus is on what can we do to manage sound levels in music venues as a sound engineer, as a musician, or as a venue manager. The whole sort of, I'm really interested in the whole picture and in the whole ecosystem. Okay, next slide. This is a long-standing, well-documented problem. In the past decade, or actually I should say the past 2 decades, we've been making some small incremental steps to reduce exposure for the audience, for performance, and for all involved staff. There are some examples from regulations and guidelines going back to Switzerland in 1996. And there's a handful of European countries you might be aware that have either enshrined in law or as a voluntary guideline some approaches to at least setting some maximum values to how loud these concerts can be. There's been the Audio Engineering Society organized a series of conferences, music-induced hearing diseases or music-induced hearing disorder, where I've contributed and met some people to start talking about these things and exchanging ideas. Then from 2018, WHO Make Listening Safe, which really was a good step forward, because it's the first time that people from very different backgrounds, very different research disciplines, but also many people from industry, different parts of the industry, sat together and had a really good look at the problem. And the question, like, we know this has been an issue since 1969. Why hasn't really anything happened? And what can we do better? Of course, we are all here because of Hella. So I'm going to assume you're aware with Hella, get Hella certified. You know the drill. But let's look at how we got here. First of all, I'm not sure if John is here, but John Barton would not fail to point out that we've got to be mindful that loudness is it's a perceptual construct. It's how we experience the level of sound. It's very subjective. What's loud for you is maybe not loud for me, or the other way around. Using sound pressure level in decibels is a well-established measurable value. It's somewhat objective, but we also know that if we measure in one venue at front of house, we may go to the next value at front of house, and might be very different because front of house is 10 meters further away from the stage, etc., etc. And there's all sorts of things. What time weighting, what averaging? Are we looking at dBA or B or C or D or Z? So it's somewhat objective, but does it mean that you can automatically compare these values? I like to think in terms of loudness culture, which is sort of the acculturation, the emergence of a culture where pop concerts being loud has become the norm. And really interesting how that happened, because I have this feeling that if we know the steps that contribute to that acculturation, maybe we can also identify steps to step back a little bit and acculturate concerts at a slightly lower level. There's a reasonably well-known paper by two researchers, Welch and Fremeau, hearing researchers, the CALM model, conditioning, adaptation, and acculturation to loud music, which in short is that it's a social ecological model. So how do we behave with our individual psychologies in a social setting? A physiologic adaptation and conditioning of people to enjoy loud sound, along with its intrinsic benefits. have combined to develop a culture of loudness in music. And the culture has a glamour, as many people are drawn into it, thus encouraging them to tolerate initial discomfort and making them vulnerable to conditioning. And conditioning means that you sort of come to expect that that's the normal way these concerts or these experiences should be. So if you haven't read it and you're interested, that's a great article to read to start thinking about, you know, why do we all rock up to these concerts and know it's going to be loud, but, you know, just accept it. What do we know about this? I have some conditions to that knowledge at the next slide. But the desire for greater loudness from musicians and audience comes sort of from the mid-1960s, and it brought an increased SPL. At the same time, since the 1960s, throughout the decades, the 5 decades in between then and now, more concerts, more events, more festivals with larger audiences. So maybe the SPL didn't go up, but the number of people exposed to all those sounds, those high sound levels grew, and also more often every year. In that period, globally, there are still growing numbers of people with more leisure time and money to spend for this kind of entertainment events and spending their time enjoying music. And in addition, since the Walkman, so what we're talking early 80s, we've also grown used to taking music with us and playing music on our headphones, which is maybe not as loud as a rock concert, but it's the duration that matters there. If you walk around with your headphones for 4 or 5 hours a day, you may actually be, just offering a lot of energy to your hearing and put it a bit on edge. That also includes gaming, and then also increasingly motorized sports, gun hobbies, leaf blowers. We are exposed to an increase in number of different sound sources that are quite loud. Then, when we want to talk about the history of live sound, this is something this is from a paper from 2015, a long time ago. And for my PhD, I tried to, get some sort of solid idea of the history of live sound. What happened first? Who did what first? And I found out that there is no one single historical trajectory. There are many different parallel little histories. Monitoring is a good example. If you read enough books, you will find 5, 6, 7, or 8 different stories where someone will very sure claim, very convinced, make the claim that they invented monitoring first, or that they were the first tour to involve monitoring. And actually, it was such a logical next step that it just happened in many places at the same time, maybe a year apart, a year earlier, a year later, slightly different approach. And that actually goes for a lot of different incremental improvements to the live sound gear that we've been using, we've come to get used to. And so it's good to think about it as something that was very decentralized. So if you look at recording and radio, you rely on an infrastructure that is centralized: broadcasting, physical distribution, the internet, what have you. With live sound, you can, and this is how this started maybe even in the 1920s. Someone who maybe sold radios. Sometimes it was the local photographer. The speech from the mayor needed amplifying on the national holiday, and I just had a loudspeaker and a microphone, and boom, there's your PA system. For those PA systems to be specifically built for music took quite a long time. And this is why there's all these different trajectories emerging in continental Europe, in the UK, in Australia, in the US, in the Latin Americas, etc. And the standardization that we see now really only came with the digital age, because before that, even here where I worked in the Netherlands, if you move from one sound hire company to the next, and all of a sudden they don't have Socopex, but they've got another multi-core connector. And even when I started, there would still be on the XLR where the 2 or 3 is hot, and then we worked with the local public radio, then we'd have to switch from 2 to 3. Very interesting, but not the point today. And then you've all probably heard these questions. That's like my mom's questions about why are pop concerts getting louder all the time, or sometimes people assume, and this is more anecdotally in conversations, that these concerts get louder every year, and that in the 1960s was still bearable, but every year got louder and louder and louder. And I'll show you in a second that I don't think that's the case. Then there's the questions: why are these concerts so loud? Why do they have to be so loud? Whether we talk about the experience or the measured level, and why can't you just turn it down? You know, I've got my stereo here and I can just turn it down. Why can't you just turn it down? All right, first question first, after I drank some water. Have concerts really been getting louder over time? SPL started increasing roughly in the mid-1960s for reasons that I'll get to in a second. But there are some key moments of change. Audio engineering started to develop more with music and vice versa. Music started responding more to technical possibilities. For instance, late 1950s, multi-track sound recording really changed how music is produced, etc. Those kinds of interrelations between technological development and music practice. To some extent, the increase in SPL was driven by technology, to some extent driven by music, to some extent driven by social cultural factors. And then what about the unamplified concerts? Yeah, so for a long time in the Western world, in the more, I don't know, the more elitist or the more cultured world in Western Europe, the benchmark was the symphonical concert in the symphony hall, where the audience is silence, right? There's no singing along, there's only clapping where you're supposed to clap. And there's no participation other than maybe not coughing and buying a ticket and saying that it was marvelous. It sets a very high bar to make music where where you have an audience of up to 2,000 people that is silent and speechless and is supposedly and completely focused just on your music. And we have a feeling, because often that pertains to classical music, or we call classical music, that's a very old tradition, but it isn't. The tradition goes back, it depends a little bit where you look in Europe. For instance, in Amsterdam, in the Concertgebouw, which is a really famous concert hall, the silent tradition started in the 1890s. And simply because the orchestra got more professional, the conductors got more professional. Whereas when that venue opened, it had nice lounge tables, loungy chairs. You could smoke your cigars, order drinks, and have a chat while the orchestra was playing away. And then at one point, the orchestra said, "Wow, you gotta all shut up your drinking. You gotta listen to us. We rehearsed the entire week." And so there was that notion of the silent concert is relatively new. There are earlier examples in France, for instance, already earlier in the 19th century, but it's not something that has been with music forever, which is sometimes, it seems, sort of automatically implied with how strong that tradition is. At the same time, some symphonic concert can take place in quite hard SPLs, maybe not all the time, but it can certainly be loud, which we see at the incidence of hearing disorders in people who play in these orchestras. What's risky there is that you start working with sort of creating these opposing sides of, well, we've got classical concerts that are acoustic, and then we've got pop concerts that are electric, and we've got acoustic music good, electric music bad. So you got to be a little bit mindful, because it's simply not that simple. And whether it's acoustic music or classical music, when you use amplification, you can have more audience number. You can address more people, you can sell more tickets, or please more people with your music. And what happened there, and I've got a case study from just the late 1930s, sort of uncoupled the relation between acoustic and music. So for a symphonic orchestra, you need a room with acoustics of a symphony hall. If you play that outside or in a pop venue, it's going to sound very different and be very hard for the musicians to play. and to hear each other. This is a case study. Marian Anderson, she was an Afro-American operatic singer who in the 1930s was quite famous, particularly in Europe. When she came back to the United States to tour in Washington, she was going to play in this concert hall of it was a venue was by of the Daughters of the American Revolution, and they decided really short before the concert that they would not open their rooms to an Afro-American performer. And some very influential Washingtonians took offense, and they organized an outdoor performance for Marian Anderson at the Lincoln Mall, which is an important landmark. It apparently is changing color these days in Washington, to a silent audience, because this was operatic music, of 70,000. And this is what that looked like. I've drawn a little arrow that points at this horn loudspeaker. There's another one, as you can imagine, on the other side. So this is operatic music performed for 70,000 people. And there is some interesting people that wrote some stories about it when it happens. Really interesting. Apparently it was a really special occasion. Of course, 25 years later, in 1963, this is where Dr. Martin Luther King spoke his famous words at the rally for the March for Jobs and Food, which was also, there was a rally, but it was also a little bit of a pop concert, because there were all these musicians performing there. With almost virtually the same PA as in 1939. It was a little bit bigger, but it was still state of the art. That's not the point. I just want to sort of show what started happening in this era, that musicians, performance organizers, and audience started to discover that this connection of you need a certain acoustics for a certain music could be dissociated, could be unpacked if you use this wonderful amplification technology. I'm going to quit this one. That's not so important. And to show you how that developed, I've got another case study. This is one of my favorite. Oh, I really hope that the sound is also shared here. I have no idea. Otherwise, I'll tell you what was supposed to hear. So Elvis, 1956. This was when he was already really, really famous. His first movie had already come out. He already had his first string of great hits. He was gonna, before joining the military service, he was gonna do these 2 concerts in Tupelo in Mississippi, where he's from, and 2 afternoon concerts for 5,000 people. And at that time, the audience was already yelling, and all his fans and everyone wanted to sing along. The audience was quite loud, and there is quite a bit of documentation that says that regularly at concerts, Elvis had to ask the audience to quiet down and to stop yelling so that everyone can hear. So that already shows that sort of participatory element where people can respond and be noisy really started to emerge in the 50s. There are 3 different media resources of this concert. I'm going to play you the first one. Let me just see. Can you hear sound? Can you guys hear the sound of that clip? Sound is working great. And now I just need to try and make it full screen. Come on. Well, the image is not really the point. Although it's nice, you can see there's a local field with a stage, and on each side we can see 2 horn loudspeakers on poles. He's singing into a microphone in his hand, and then there is an unamplified drummer, a bass player, and a guitarist, each playing through their whole amplifier. And when I first found this clip, I thought, but why is there some big band playing? Why don't we hear Elvis, or why don't we hear what's going on? And it turns out the recording crew had some issues, technical issues, and the recording for the film sounds like this. except for 2 seconds in a little while where you actually hear almost. So for a few seconds, we actually, there was the technical issue, maybe the ground loop, whatever, was fixed. And we hear what the microphone in the middle of stage, just a meter in front of Elvis, picked up. And you can hear bass, you can hear the drums, you can hear the guitar, and you hear people scream. You can't hear Elvis sing. Because, you know, he doesn't sing loud enough for his voice to carry as far as the recording microphone. It's as simple as that. But it gives, because it's that microphone is very edge of the stage, gives us a little bit of an audience vantage point, at least for people close to the stage. And then 20 years later, a bootleg of that concert appeared. You can hear the resonance of the horn loudspeakers there. So this is the bootleg with someone holding a microphone up to one of the horns. And that was later released as a DVD with the footage from the movie crew. Let me show you the next slide. Here is some zoomed in. Here you can see, this is the guy. He was doing the bootleg. He was from a local radio station. He had a little recorder, maybe even a wire recorder, I'm not really sure. And here you can see he's plugged in. He plugged in his recorder on stage, like any contemporary stage manager would go like, "But Elvis is going to trip over that cable." And he had a microphone that a mate was holding up here, beautiful old RCA microphone to one of the horn loudspeakers. And here in this photo here on the right, you can see the microphone the film crew used. Yeah, so we've got this unique, different vantage point, and a lot of people in the front would have not have heard his voice. That is, you know, we can, that until you come in range of those horn loudspeakers, you're simply not going to hear Elvis. So one of the reasons that we needed bigger PAs is because these sort of just this vocal approach just didn't work anymore. The not so silenced audience, very well documented, of course, with the Beatles. But there is already, for instance, a great example in the mid-50s. Lionel Hampton was a jazz vibraphone player, and he had a band that really played rock and roll, kind of really, really groovy jazz. And there's all these photos of everybody dancing in this classical. Well, it was in the Concertgebouw in Amsterdam, in this classical concert hall, and all the snooty people were saying, "It's an outrage! These young people misbehaving." And so this notion that music is participatory and the audience is there to dance and sing along and have a good time, you know, really started coming back. I'm not going to go into that particular neck of the wood. Another really common element there is the power of the electric guitar and the role of the electric guitar just becoming more important. So up until that time, band performers were sort of in balance. The backline was in balance, and only the vocals were amplified. Then from the mid 1960s, the guitar amps got louder and louder, to the point that louder for different reasons. So more powerful sound, more powerful music, use of intentional distortion, intentional feedback. So they came to the point, for instance, bands like The Who came to the point where they had to amplify the drums as well. And then amplifying the singer through the same guitar amp didn't work anymore. So they needed a bigger vocal PA, etc., to the point that it became necessary to amplify the whole band. And this, fascinatingly, this happened, like it's again, this happened in many different places in the world. It's not just one single history, but in London, it's quite concentrated. It happened in quite small venues. These were small clubs up to 250 people, and they started bringing increasingly big, in the case of the Who, Marshall amps on stage, and this got really, really loud. And there is there's quite a few sources, lots and lots of interviews with Townsend and other band members about that period. But one thing that Townsend remarks is also that he got really sick of playing in a pub and then sort of having to hear all the people banter and chat about other things. He just wanted to blow the audience away so that they at least couldn't speak and annoy him anymore. Yeah, so that started happening. At the same time, the audience increased to even larger sizes in these big outdoor festivals, Woodstock most famously, which at that point probably wasn't very loud, but the audience was very big, and that simply required larger PA systems and a new demand for more SPL. It's really interesting to maybe we know quite a bit of detail about the sound system at Woodstock. And what loudspeakers did. These were in part loudspeakers that were designed for cinemas. We know what these loudspeakers were and what amplifiers. So maybe one day we can calculate. We add up those typical amplifiers and typical loudspeakers and their typical sensitivity. Maybe we can do some estimates about how loud Woodstock was. But I'm going to guess it wasn't very loud. The same period, I got Monterey Festival in California, where you can see cinema electric loudspeakers, and then in the UK, WEM started building specific loudspeakers for music amplification, with some of the earliest transistor amplifiers. And yeah, it's also one of the narratives where all of a sudden there was some on-stage monitoring, for what it's worth. And then when we're in the late 1960s, and we want to ask how loud were these concerts. This is also when the first articles emerge already, where people, hearing specialists or health and well-being organizations started saying, well, this is all very loud. It's probably dangerously loud. There's a big chance that people are damaging their hearing if they go to these concerts. And some articles from that period provide some measurements, but it's not always clear how they were measured, where they were measured, and how the values were averaged. But the most detailed article is from 1967, Lebo et al. And you can see when you look at it, there's two venues, A and B, with DBC on the left and DBA on the right, with a max and a minimum and an average. This is not very different from what we measure in at concerts these days, or at least maybe a few years ago, because now, of course, we're working with the WHO standard, or we've learned to bring these levels down a bit. But one interesting thing of note here is and then, come on, you can do it. PowerPoint. Yeah, there we go. An interesting difference with now is that, now we work with a difference between dBA and dBc, between the low and the middle frequencies of 10 or more decibels. And at this time, that wasn't as pronounced. Here, the difference between A and C is maybe 4 or 7 decibels on average. So that's interesting. That probably didn't have the kind of efficient subwoofers that we have now, or low drivers, and that was all. Yeah, the technology was only just developing. The bass, of course, already in 1970s became more important, and after the 70s, dance music escaped from discotheques to raves and house parties, and yeah, it became more important to feel the bass and to really experience the kick drum and the bass drum, and that visceral element, which of course also added to the amount of energy needed for concerts. And then also raves and house parties also added a longer duration of a non-stop, which of course also increases exposure over time. Yeah, some key moments of change I've addressed. So audiences got bigger, audiences got louder, but also bands try to get louder in smaller venues, which simply, in a way, contribute to normalizing that these concerts were so loud, these tiny clubs. The focal PA had to make way for a full PA system where all the sources are amplified, balanced by an operator with mixing desk, a front of house engineer. Increasing powerful PA systems increased the sound on stage, which as a consequence meant that musicians needed their own loudspeakers on stage to monitor what they're doing, and of course then their own monitor engineer, etc., etc. There was an increase in demand for bass systems, more efficiency required from even lower frequencies over time, and that had partly to do with the emergence of EDM, with a much stronger focus on that. The final one of the mom's questions: can't we just turn it down? And yeah, if you're not inside this industry, then you just think, well, when I'm at home or on my laptop or on my headphones, I can just turn down the volume. What's the problem? You've got this big mixing desk. Isn't there a volume knob that you can turn down? And you need to understand quite a bit of how the local acoustics, what happens on stage and the PA system interact, that often doesn't really make a difference. And it's not so simple. Turning it down means having a conversation with the guitarist or with the drummer or with the band, or seeing if you can reduce the sound level on stage, etc. But maybe asking the audience to not sing along, might be hard. It's not that simple. And one of the reasons that it's not that simple, apart from simply the physics of sound that come from different sources, there is no real linear path of how these concerts got louder. There's no one single reason that you can take away to fix things if you wanted to fix them. There is technological developments, musical developments, social, cultural developments, and these distinct developments fueled this acculturation that nowadays we think it's completely normal. If I go see a band, it's going to be loud. And then these days we know, well, I'll probably put some plugs in my ear or whatever. I'm not going to bring my young kids to it. What I'm starting to see is increasingly important is that in the mid-60s, when bands like The Who and many other bands around the world really started experimenting with guitar amps and bringing those levels up. When those people weren't young anymore, they kept doing that. And their audiences were young, but then in the 1970s and 80s, those audiences weren't young anymore, but they still wanted that loud music. So it's not necessarily a young people problem. And if you read the literature from the 60s and 70s, they talk about youth music, which was surprising. Well, youth music, which meaning pop music. The youth grows up, but the SPL stays. And now, if you look at some of the guidelines and regulations around in Europe, they often have lower levels for groups of people under 20 or under 18 or under 15, which I think is going to be really important. I think my own daughter is 9. She goes to have a disco at the end of term, and I don't want to be the guy who's turn it down. I haven't brought a dB meter. I'm no idea how loud it is, so I should probably measure it first. But this is when people start getting used to this. This is when the acculturation starts. This is when we think, oh, it's going to be dancing, music's going to be loud, and I'll have a beep in my ears, or my threshold will shift. So I think this is where, going forward, with things like the standard and HELA and local regulations, we can create some really start working on doing that acculturation and making it a little bit less normal. Which means I'm not saying that there shouldn't be loud concerts or there shouldn't be loud bands, but it shouldn't be the norm. Is really my thinking behind it. Yeah. There's no linear pathway back to making listening safe at concert events, but we've taken some, as I said at the start, we've taken some big steps. And I think we're getting to some signs of a changing culture, which is fantastic, including this, what I just mentioned, thinking about age groups under 20, the WA standards, and what next? Now we've got a standard. So what are we going to do to roll it out? Well, I think one of the answers is Hella. Yeah, so that's where I'll stop. And if you haven't got your Hella certification yet, then now's the time. Or if you have any questions, then you should ask them. Thank you very much for listening. Yes, there is a question. Yell out. It looks like your microphone is on mute.
You should be able to unmute your microphone now, Vargas.
It's wonderful how our technologies just keep on improving and making our lives so much easier.
You should be able to unmute your microphone now if you want to. And the same for you, Bruce.
Hiya.
Yeah, Bruce.
Yeah, just a question that I posted in the chat, really. I think one of the things that's really improved over the last 10, 20 years is probably the, distortion has gone down in sound systems. And do you think that's had a kind of effect of people trying to push it louder because they think loud is when it's distorted, or do you think that's improved everything, or what do you think about that as a kind of, a player in this game?
That's a really good question. Yeah, I think to a certain extent, distortion helps to perceive sound as loud. So particularly in the early years, maybe distortion was important to give the suggestion that it was louder. At the same time, our systems have been, seen great reductions in distortions. Distortion maybe as early as the late 80s or 90s, when stuff really got a lot more efficient. And people would have pushed for distortion-free concerts, then maybe also then indeed cranking up the level, because it still sounds good. You're not reaching the sort of maximum of your amps and your drivers. At the same time, this week I was in the BIM house in Amsterdam, which is the lovely jazz venue by the station, which is always never, I don't think they're ever anyway close to 100 decibels. It's a quiet venue, but they recently swapped their ancient American line array for a very new French line array, and they're all in agreement that it sounds 20 years better, it works 20 years better. But what they've had it for 2 years, and they now actually know they've got a measurement, they've got a Metrao measurement system, and they can see that they're louder because simply because they can, because it's got ridiculous headrooms. Even you don't, in front of house, you don't have to worry about your microphones. The gain before feedback is insane. So yeah, that's a really good question, and how we maybe as system engineers in front of house mixes respond to those changes in distortion is really interesting to consider. Again, it'd be hard to do some research into it, but yeah, certainly something to consider. Like I imagine, for instance, with the system at Woodstock, where they had those like 20-watt Macintosh tube amps to drive those big loudspeakers, I think that would have been pretty distorted. So it would have been really interesting to see what that did for the level and appreciation of the level. Bruce, does that go anywhere near answering your question?
Yeah. I think it's like you say, it's more of a discussion point really than a
Yeah.
question. It's difficult to quantify, but I think just from having been to gigs since the kind of 90s, and I think the 90s was the kind of Wild West in terms of large venue sound levels. I went to some very, very loud gigs in large venues in the 90s, and I don't think you tend to get that so much anymore. I think the real, I think it's the education is needed more in the smaller venues actually. I think they can do some real damage. But yeah, I mean the sound quality at festivals and larger venues has come on so much in the last 20 years. But I just wonder whether some people then think, oh, it doesn't sound loud. It's like, well, it is loud. It's just what you mean is it doesn't sound distorted, and that's what you're kind of, I think there's a really interesting interplay to those kind of those points really.
Yeah. One of like maybe I don't know 10 years ago, one of Adam's master students looked at adding little bits of distortion to the mix to give the suggestion of loudness, which is of course a really similar to like John Burton adding infrasound to to the sub-low to give the suggestion of loudness. It's certainly something we can play with and experiment with. Yeah. Vargas, you had a question. Are you now able to?
I think it's in the Q&A tab. I think
the
mic's
Q&A.
not working.
Okay, let me see if I can access the Q&A without entering my password. Oh, the difference between DBC and DBA. Yeah, we've got really good data on that these days. For rock and pop, it's often 10 decibels, but for house and EDM, it's more between 50 and sometimes even 20. I think those averages are quite consistent in the data. For instance, that Marcel Kok, who is this sound guy from Europe who collected all the data, has. Yeah. So slightly different to what we know from the late 60s. From 2 concerts. It's not a lot of data to go by. Any more questions or responses? And my email is right here. If you got a response or idea, reach out. And thank you, Paul. Yeah. It's I can't stress enough that for most of us we weren't there, we weren't in different places. I don't think there's ever going to be a singular history. It's just lots of people. Something I tell my students, they want to be in a band, they want to be famous, and then I say, well, you were in high school, how many bands were there? And there were maybe 3 bands. I said, well, how many high schools? How many high schools are in the UK? The 15,000 high schools in the UK. So maybe at any given time there's 45,000 bands, just making these numbers up as I go. But there's always a lot of people working with this stuff and pushing in different directions, which is sort of tells me that don't go searching for too precise a history or too accurate a history, but just try to look at these themes that seem to unite the narrative. Alrighty, if there are no further questions, then we should just go about our day. There's 3 minutes left in the hour. I do apologize for the wait at the start. It's an interesting time to try and log on to anything. All right, everyone. Have a wonderful afternoon, and maybe I'll see some of you in Derby in a few weeks' time.